In December of 1979, a young Steve Jobs walked into a research lab in Palo Alto, California. What he saw that day would go on to define personal computing for the next 50 years. A computer with a screen full of overlapping windows, icons you could click, a strange little device that moved a cursor around the screen. None of it was Apple's idea. It all belonged to a company you probably only think of as the printer people. This is the story of Xerox, the company that built the future, not once, but multiple times, and somehow still lost almost all of it. Let's go back further than 1979, though. Founded in 1906, Xerox built its entire empire on one invention, xerography, the process behind the modern photocopier. By the 1960s and 70s, Xerox absolutely dominated that market. This was one of the most profitable technology companies in America, headquartered on the East Coast in Connecticut. And in 1970, flush with that success, Xerox made an unusual decision. They opened a research lab 3,000 miles away in Palo Alto, California, and gave it a strange kind of freedom. This lab, PARC, short for Palo Alto Research Center, wasn't pressured to make products. It was built to imagine the future of computing with almost no restrictions. And the culture there reflected that freedom completely. PARC's atmosphere was described at the time as West Coast hippie-influenced, nothing like the buttoned-up corporate culture at Xerox headquarters back in Connecticut. Keep that contrast in mind. It's going to matter a lot later in this story.
Because what this one lab produced in less than a decade is almost hard to believe. The computer mouse, Ethernet, the networking technology still used today, developed by a researcher named Bob Metcalfe. The graphical user interface, windows, icons, clickable menus, laser printing, even an early version of word processing where the document on your screen looked exactly like the printed page, what we now call WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. One lab, nearly every foundational piece of how we still use computers today. Now, here's something most retellings of this story skip entirely. Xerox didn't fumble every single one of these. Laser printing is the exception, and it's worth understanding why. An engineer named Gary Starkweather developed the core laser printing concept in the early 1970s. Initially, Xerox leadership saw no reason to pursue it. Their existing printing technology already worked fine, commercially. But an executive named Goldman intervened and had Starkweather transferred to PARC to keep developing it. By 1972, there was a working prototype. Xerox brought it to market in 1977, 5 years after the prototype existed, but they did bring it to market, and it became a genuine best-selling product for the company.
So, Xerox proved with laser printing that they could take a PARC invention all the way to a successful commercial product. That's important. It means what happened with the GUI and Ethernet wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, made differently each time.
So, back to 1979. Steve Jobs wanted a tour of PARC. In exchange, Xerox was allowed to buy 100,000 shares of Apple stock for $1 million. Xerox agreed, and Jobs got his demo. He saw the Alto, Xerox's experimental computer, built years earlier by researcher Chuck Thacker, with its graphical interface and mouse-driven controls. According to people in the room that day, Jobs was electrified. One account has him practically shouting, "Why aren't you doing anything with this?" Jobs left PARC and set Apple on a new course. Years later, this became the Lisa, and then the Macintosh. Now, here's where most retellings get it wrong, and I want to get it right. The popular version says Xerox executives were clueless, just sat on this technology, and let Apple casually walk away with it. That's not quite true. Xerox actually did bring this technology to market first. It was called the Xerox Star, released in 1981, 2 full years before Apple's Lisa. But the Star cost around $17,000, with a complete office setup running over $50,000. It was sold through Xerox's existing enterprise sales force, the same teams built to sell photocopiers to large companies, not personal computers to regular people. Roughly 25,000 units sold, total. For comparison, 3 years later, Apple's Macintosh, far cheaper, aimed at individual consumers, reached hundreds of thousands of buyers within its first year alone.
And here's the part of this story that rarely gets told. What happened to the researchers themselves? Partly out of frustration, partly out of entrepreneurial ambition, some of PARC's own inventors eventually just left and built their ideas into companies of their own. Bob Metcalfe, who developed Ethernet, left in 1979 to found 3Com and helped make Ethernet the global networking standard it remains today, just not under Xerox's name. Researchers John Warnock and Charles Geschke left to found a company that would become Adobe, turning PARC-influenced printing and document technology into one of the most important software companies in the world. Under U.S. law at the time, many of PARC's software innovations, like a clickable screen icon, weren't even patentable. Researchers often published their work openly at conferences, essentially handing the ideas to the entire industry, Xerox included or not. So it wasn't just that Xerox failed to commercialize these ideas. The people who built them eventually took the ideas elsewhere and built the company Xerox itself never became.
So why did this keep happening? Why laser printing, yes, but the GUI, Ethernet, no? Researchers and historians who've studied this point to the same root cause over and over: distance and incentive. Xerox's headquarters, sales force, and leadership incentives were all built around one product line: copiers, thousands of miles away from PARC, both geographically and culturally. Every internal promotion, every sales bonus, every leadership decision was calibrated around protecting and growing that existing, wildly profitable business. A revolutionary invention from a lab most executives rarely visited that didn't fit the existing sales motion was often treated as a curiosity, not a priority. Meanwhile, Apple had no legacy business to protect at all. When Jobs saw the GUI, there was nothing internally competing for the company's attention or resources. Apple could bet everything on it immediately.
Xerox didn't collapse the way some of these stories go, not overnight, and not from this alone. The company kept its core printing and copier business for decades afterward, but it never became what it could have been. The company that invented personal computing as we know it never built a meaningful personal computer business of its own. And its core business faced its own long decline, too. Digital transformation eroded copier and print demand for years. By the 2000s and 2010s, Xerox underwent repeated restructurings, layoffs, and leadership changes, trying to remain relevant in a world its own PARC lab had helped invent. In 2023, Xerox quietly donated PARC itself, the lab that changed computing history, to a nonprofit research institute, a symbolic final chapter to the story. So what actually happened here? It wasn't a lack of vision. Xerox's researchers had more vision than almost anyone in computing at that time. It wasn't a total failure to try either. They proved with laser printing that they could do this right. What Xerox lacked was a company built to sell more than one thing, an organization so wired around protecting its existing profitable business that even its own most brilliant inventions kept losing internally to a copier division's sales targets. The lesson isn't don't miss the future. Xerox didn't miss it. They built it more than once. The lesson is inventing the future and being able to sell it are two completely different problems. Most companies only ever solve one. If you liked this one, next time we're covering another company that built something incredible and still couldn't get it to the people who needed it. Subscribe so you don't miss it.